The call comes in at 11:47 p.m. on a Monday night in May 1991. A Milwaukee police dispatcher receives a report of a young man, naked, bleeding, stumbling in the street. Two officers respond within minutes. When they arrive at the corner of North 25th Street and West State Street, they find a 14-year-old boy, disoriented and barely conscious, with a hole drilled into his skull. The officers call the man, who says the boy is his friend. He is calm, he is polite. He explains, without raising his voice, that this is a domestic situation, that the boy had too much to drink, that everything is fine. The officers believe him. They escort the boy back to the man's apartment on the second floor of a brick building that smells of industrial cleaner and something else, something the officers either don't notice or don't name in their report. They write that there was no cause for further action. They leave. The boy's name is Konarak Sinta. He is never seen alive again. That night, and what happened in the hours after those officers walked away, is not just the most catastrophic single failure in this entire investigation. It is the moment that concentrates everything: the institutional blind spots, the missed warnings, the years of evidence that dissolved in plain sight. To understand how a man killed 17 people across 13 years in 2 different states and was stopped only because one victim managed to escape with a handcuff still dangling from his wrist, you have to go back further, much further. You have to go back to 1978, to a small house in Bath Township, Ohio, and to a boy who had already started down a road that no one around him could see. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, at Evangelical Deaconess Hospital. His early childhood was unremarkable in the ways that matter most. He had a roof, a family, a neighborhood. His father, Lionel Dahmer, was an analytical chemist, methodical and detail-oriented, the kind of man who found comfort in procedures and measurable outcomes. His mother, Joyce, struggled with mental health issues and a dependence on prescription medication that deepened as the years went on. The household was tense in the specific, low-grade way that children absorb without fully understanding. Arguments that started in the kitchen and moved to the bedroom. Prolonged silences at the dinner table. A sense of uncertainty that had no single source and no resolution. By the time Jeffrey was in elementary school, at Hazel Harvey Peace Elementary in Milwaukee, and later at Barberton Schools in Ohio, after the family relocated, his parents' marriage was fracturing along fault lines that would eventually swallow the family whole. What the neighbors and teachers noticed about young Jeffrey was not cruelty, it was withdrawal, a quietness that moved past shyness into something harder to name. He had a habit, documented later by his own account, of collecting roadkill, small animals he found on the side of Ohio roads near the family's property in Bath Township, and stripping the flesh from the bones with a kind of focused, unhurried attention. He kept the remains in jars, arranged on a shelf in the garage. He told his father he was curious about chemistry, about decomposition, about what held a living creature together at the structural level. Lionel, a chemist himself, found this at least partially relatable. No one who knew Jeffrey then flagged this as alarming in any formal sense. Children do strange things. Boys especially, the thinking went, go through phases that look unsettling from the outside and mean nothing at all. By his early teens, Jeffrey was drinking regularly. Beer mostly consumed alone or in the woods behind the family's house on West Bath Road. a rural property his parents had moved to in 1968. The house sat on approximately 1.7 acres, surrounded by trees and low brush, set back far enough from the road that the nearest neighbor was not visible from the front porch. It was the kind of place where you could do things without anyone noticing. The nearest town was Akron, about 12 miles south. In 1977, his parents' divorce proceedings began in earnest, loud, and acrimonious, with both parents cycling through periods of absence. By the summer of 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old and effectively alone in that house. His mother, Joyce, had taken his younger brother David and left for Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, without telling Jeffrey she was going. His father, Lionel, had moved out weeks earlier to stay with a relative while the divorce finalized. For several weeks. The exact duration is a matter of some dispute in the record, but the minimum appears to be 3 weeks. Jeffrey Dahmer lived by himself in a rural Ohio house with no supervision, no structure, no money beyond what was left in the kitchen, and no one checking in. It was in those weeks, June 1978, that he killed for the first time. The victim was Steven Mark Hicks, 19 years old, from Coventry Township, Ohio. Hicks was hitchhiking on June 18, 1978, near the intersection of State Route 224 and Cleveland-Massillon Road, heading to a concert at Chippewa Lake Park. He had long brown hair, a relaxed manner, and the easy confidence of someone who had hitched rides before without incident. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. He had plans for the rest of the summer. Dahmer offered him a beer and an invitation to hang out at the house for a while. Hicks accepted. They spent several hours together, drinking, talking. Dahmer later described it as one of the few times in his adolescence he had felt something close to companionship. And then Hicks said he wanted to leave. Dahmer did not want him to leave. What followed, what Dahmer described in clinical, almost detached terms during his 1994 confession to Detective Dennis Murphy, was an act of violence committed with a barbell from the garage. Hicks was struck from behind while he stood near the driveway, rendered unconscious, then strangled with the same bar. Dahmer then did what he would do again and again over the next 13 years. He took the body apart. He buried the remains in a shallow grave behind the house, then weeks later dug them up, used a sledgehammer to pulverize the larger bones, and scattered the fragments through the woods and along a drainage ditch on the property. Steven Hicks disappeared completely. His family filed a missing persons report. They received no answers. They would not know what happened to him for 13 years, until Dahmer told investigators in the fall of 1991. Dahmer enrolled at Ohio State University in Columbus in the fall of 1978, about 4 months after the killing. He lasted 1 semester. The drinking was constant and escalating. Classmates later recalled him appearing in the dormitory common areas of Merill Tower with a bag full of rum, drinking steadily through the afternoon and into the evening, showing up to morning classes visibly impaired. He failed most of his coursework. His grade transcript from that semester shows a pattern of incompletes and failing marks across multiple subjects. By the end of 1978, he had dropped out entirely. His father, Lionel, frustrated and increasingly alarmed by what he saw as a lack of direction, pushed him toward the military as a corrective structure. In January 1979, Jeffrey Dahmer enlisted in the United States Army at a recruitment office in Akron. He completed basic training at Fort McClellan in Alabama, then received his medical training at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. He was subsequently transferred to Baumholder, West Germany, where he served as a combat medic with the 2nd Battalion, 68th Armored Regiment. His fellow soldiers remembered him as a heavy drinker and a loner who kept odd hours, but not as someone who caused obvious disciplinary trouble. He was, by most accounts, competent at the technical aspects of his job. He was discharged in March 1981, not for any specific incident or infraction, but because his drinking had made him functionally unreliable. The Army's assessment was straightforward and bureaucratic. He was not suited for continued service. He was sent home with an honorable discharge, which meant he left with no formal record of misconduct and no flag that would follow him into civilian life. What followed was a period of drifting that lasted the better part of a year. He spent time in Miami Beach, Florida, living in a room at the Bimini Bay Motel, working briefly at a sandwich shop, running out of money with a speed that suggested he was drinking most of what he earned. He slept on the beach on at least one occasion, by his own account. His father eventually arranged for him to travel north and stay with his paternal grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, at her home at 2357 South 57th Street in West Allis, Wisconsin, a working-class suburb about 5 miles southwest of downtown Milwaukee. That arrangement lasted from late 1981 through the summer of 1988, nearly 7 years. And for most of those years, there was a surface stability that his father found reassuring. He held jobs, including a position at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center and later at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. He attended church with his grandmother on Sunday mornings. He was, by external appearances, a man who had found his footing. But underneath that surface, something had not gone away. It had been waiting, and it was beginning to move again. In 1982, he was cited for indecent exposure at the Wisconsin State Fair in West Allis, a misdemeanor handled quietly, generating a record but no significant consequence. In 1986, he was arrested again for indecent exposure, this time for exposing himself to 2 young boys near the Kinnickinnic River. He was convicted, placed on probation for 1 year, and required to undergo counseling sessions. At his sentencing hearing, he told the judge he had simply been urinating outdoors and had not realized anyone was nearby. The judge accepted this explanation as plausible. The probation was light. The counseling was brief and apparently produced no formal flag of concern in any official record. In 1987, 9 years after Steven Hicks, Jeffrey Dahmer killed again. The second victim was Stephen Toomey, 26 years old, a man Dahmer met at a gay bar in Milwaukee's downtown district called Club 219, located at 219 South 2nd Street. The bar was a fixture of Milwaukee's gay community in the 1980s. A narrow, low-lit space with a jukebox and a back room, the kind of place where people went to be around others without having to explain themselves. Dahmer and Toomey drank together over the course of several hours on the night of November 20th, 1987, then took a room at the Ambassador Hotel on West Wisconsin Avenue. The Ambassador was a mid-range hotel that had seen better decades, carpeted hallways, heavy curtain rods, the particular silence of a building where people paid by the night. Dahmer later claimed he had no clear memory of what happened after they went to the room. He woke, he said, and Toomey was dead beside him, with bruising on his chest and neck, consistent with strangulation. Whether that account of dissociation is accurate or a performance designed to distance himself from the deliberate nature of the act, the result was the same. He went to a nearby store, bought the largest suitcase he could find, a hard-sided piece of luggage large enough to hold a body folded at the joints, took a cab to his grandmother's house in West Allis, and spent the next several days in the basement, dismembering and disposing of the remains. Stephen Toomey's body was never found. His family filed a missing persons report. The case went cold almost immediately. Between 1987 and 1988, Dahmer killed 3 more men. All of them met in or around the bars and bus stops of Milwaukee's near South Side. James Doxtator was 14 years old, the youngest victim after Konarak sent the Somphone. A young Native American man whom Dahmer met outside Club 219 in January 1988 and lured to his grandmother's basement with an offer of money to pose for photographs. Richard Guerrero was 25 years old, met in March 1988 in a similar manner. The pattern was establishing itself with a terrible and methodical consistency. A meeting in a public place, an offer of money, or a place to stay, a private location, and then silence. Each of these men was reported missing. Each report went nowhere. In September 1988, his grandmother Catherine finally asked him to leave. The late nights coming home smelling of chemicals and something she couldn't identify. The strange sounds from the basement at odd hours. A smell that had been building for months, which she had attributed at various points to a broken drain, to garbage, to something dead in the walls. She had raised this with him more than once. He had provided explanations that she accepted because she loved him, and because the alternative, the real explanation, was not something her mind could reach toward. She asked him to find his own place. He did. The court-appointed psychological evaluators assessed Dahmer as a low to moderate risk for reoffending, noting his lack of prior convictions for violence. He was released from the work release program after 10 months in March 1990, having served less than a year. He was placed under the supervision of a probation officer named Donna Chester, who was required to make regular contact with him and to monitor his compliance with the terms of his release. While on probation, while legally required to report regularly to Chester, while prohibited by the terms of his release from consuming alcohol or having minors in his home, while supposedly under the structured oversight of the criminal justice system, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments, a 3-story brick building at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee's North Side neighborhood. He secured his previous position at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory on North 30th Street, working the night shift from 3 in the morning until 11 in the afternoon, 5 days a week. The shift suited him. The hours between 11 a.m. and midnight were his own, and he began killing at a pace that had no precedent in the years before. Between May 1989 and July 1991, he killed 12 more people. Anthony Sears, 26, in March 1989. The first victim killed after Dahmer's conviction for the assault of Somsack Sintha Somphone, and therefore the first person who died while Dahmer was under active court supervision. Then Ricky Beeks, 33, in May 1990. Raymond Smith, 32, in June 1990. Edward Smith, 27, in June 1990. Ernest Miller, 22, in September 1990. A dance student from Chicago, who had come to Milwaukee to visit family. David Thomas, 22, in September 1990. Then, in 1991, the pace accelerated further. Curtis Straughter, 18, in February. Errol Lindsay, 19, in April. Tony Hughes, 31, in May. A deaf man who communicated with Dahmer through written notes, some of which were later found in the apartment. Konarak Synthesophone, 14, in May. Matt Turner, 20, in June. Jeremiah Weinberger, 23, in June. Oliver Lacey, 23, in July. Joseph Braidhoff, 25, in July. The names accumulate. Each one was a person who had come to Milwaukee or who lived there already, looking for something ordinary, work, connection, a night out, a way to make rent. Each one ended up in apartment 213. The apartment itself was the operational center of everything Dahmer had become. It was a small space, a studio layout, roughly 500 square feet, with a kitchen alcove, a bathroom, and a main room that served as living area and bedroom. The building's other residents were working-class people, many of them families, who kept to themselves in the way that people in dense urban housing often do. Neighbors reported smells they couldn't explain, a sweetish chemical odor that seemed to intensify in warm weather, seeping under doors and into the hallway. One neighbor, Pamela Bass, who lived directly across the hall, later said that Dahmer had on multiple occasions given her food through the barely open door of his apartment. Sandwich meat, she recalled, which she had eaten without question because she was his neighbor, and he seemed quiet and harmless. She had no way of knowing what she was eating. The building manager received formal complaints about the odors on at least 2 occasions and confronted Dahmer directly. Dahmer explained that his fish tank had malfunctioned and a large fish had died inside it, creating a decomposition smell that was difficult to eliminate. The explanation was accepted both times. The odors continued. Inside the apartment, investigators working the scene in July and August 1991 would document what Dahmer had constructed over the course of more than 2 years, a functional charnel house organized with a methodical, almost bureaucratic attention to logistics. A 57-gallon blue plastic barrel of hydrochloric acid solution positioned in the corner of the main room, in which he dissolved the skeletal remains of victims after removing the parts he intended to keep. A chest freezer in the kitchen alcove containing 3 human heads, a torso, and assorted other remains. A cardboard box in the bedroom closet containing 2 skulls that had been boiled and painted gray. Dahmer told investigators he had been in the process of constructing a personal shrine, a private altar of sorts that he intended to install in the apartment as a kind of meditative space. Polaroid photographs, 74 of them, eventually catalogued by investigators, that served as a visual record of what he had done to the people he brought home, taken at various stages of the process. A human heart, wrapped carefully in plastic, stored in the refrigerator, alongside ordinary food. A human head in the same refrigerator, less carefully wrapped. When investigators completed their initial inventory of apartment 213, they had documented evidence connected to 11 of Dahmer's 17 victims in a space that, in any other context, would have been an unremarkable studio apartment in a mid-density urban neighborhood. The building had a manager. It had neighbors on every side. It was 2 blocks from a school. Dahmer's probation officer, Donna Chester, had made regular visits to the apartment as required by the terms of his supervision. visits that Dahmer had managed by keeping the door mostly closed, by explaining away any odors, by presenting as cooperative and stable. None of those visits had produced a formal concern. None had resulted in a search of the premises. The closest the system came to stopping him, before it actually did, was that night in May 1991, the night of Konarak Sinthasomphone. Konarak was the younger brother of the boy Dahmer had assaulted in 1988. He was 14 years old, a Laotian American boy who lived with his family in Milwaukee. He had been approached by Dahmer near a shopping area, lured to the apartment under false pretenses, drugged with a coffee laced with sleeping medication, and then subjected to a procedure that Dahmer later described to investigators in terms that were both precise and deeply disturbing. He had drilled a hole into the boy's skull and injected muriatic acid into the cavity, part of what he described as an attempt to create a permanent, compliant companion. The stated goal was to lobotomize the victim in a way that would eliminate the will to leave while keeping the body alive. The procedure had not worked as intended. Konarak had regained partial consciousness while Dahmer left the apartment to purchase beer from a nearby store. He made it out the front door of the building. He was found in the street by two young women, Nicole Childress and Sandra Smith, who recognized immediately that the boy was in serious distress, naked, bleeding from the head, barely able to stand, unresponsive to questions in any coherent way. They called 911 at approximately 11:30 p.m. and stayed with the boy until officers arrived. When officers John Balkerzak and Joseph Gabrish arrived on the scene, Dahmer was already there, having returned from the store and found the boy gone. He was composed, his voice was level. He explained to the officers that the boy was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that they had been drinking and had an argument, that this kind of thing happens sometimes, and was not a matter for police involvement. The officers noted in their report that the boy smelled of alcohol. They did not run the address through their dispatch system. They did not run Dahmer's name through the criminal database. If they had run the address, 924 North 25th Street, apartment 213, they would have found the 1988 case file for the assault of Somsak Sinthasomphone, which had occurred at a previous address but was linked to Dahmer's name. If they had run Dahmer's name, they would have found that he was a convicted sex offender, currently serving 5 years of probation, with a specific prohibition against having minors in his home. They had, in other words, two independent pathways to information that would have required them to detain Dahmer and remove the boy from his custody. They used neither. Nicole Childress and Sandra Smith protested. They told the officers the boy was a child, that something was seriously wrong, that this was not a domestic dispute between adults. The officers did not record their statements in the report. They escorted Konarak back upstairs to apartment 213, briefly looked around the main room. Dahmer had apparently tidied before leaving for the store, and left. One of the two officers, in a radio transmission recorded on the department's frequency and later obtained by journalists following Dahmer's arrest, made a joking reference to the call. Both officers were eventually fired by the Milwaukee Police Department in the aftermath of the Dahmer case. Both were subsequently reinstated through union arbitration proceedings. The city of Milwaukee ultimately paid $850,000 in civil settlements to the families of victims who died after that night, an acknowledgement in the language of liability that the department had failed in its duty. Within an hour of the officers leaving apartment 213, Konarak Sinthasamphone was dead. The arrest that finally ended 13 years of killing came on July 22, 1991. Tracy Edwards, 32 years old, had met Dahmer at a mall near downtown Milwaukee and agreed to come back to the apartment. He had been offered money. He had been told it would be a brief visit. Once inside, Dahmer managed to get a handcuff secured around Edwards' left wrist before Edwards fully understood what was happening. Edwards later described the next several hours as a sustained exercise in controlled terror. Dahmer moving between periods of apparent calm and sudden, unpredictable agitation, pressing a large hunting knife against Edwards' chest, watching a videotape of The Exorcist III, and rocking back and forth with a rhythmic, trance-like quality, occasionally pressing his ear against Edwards' chest to listen to his heartbeat. The apartment smelled of chemicals and something beneath the chemicals. The freezer hummed in the kitchen alcove. Edwards watched for an opening over the course of approximately 4 hours. He kept his voice calm. He told Dahmer he needed to use the bathroom. He agreed to whatever Dahmer said. At some point near midnight, Dahmer became momentarily distracted. His attention shifted. His grip on the knife relaxed slightly, and Edwards drove his fist into Dahmer's face with enough force to stagger him, crossed the apartment in several steps, and made it out the front door and down the stairs of the Oxford Apartments, with the handcuff still locked around his left wrist, the other cuff swinging loose. He ran to the corner of North 25th Street and flagged down a passing police car. Officers Robert Routh and Rolf Muller listened to his account, noted the handcuff, and drove back to the apartment with him. Dahmer answered the door calmly, in the same composed, cooperative manner he had used every time the police had come to his door before. He said the key to the handcuff was in the bedroom. Officer Muller went to retrieve it. In the bedroom, he opened the top drawer of a dresser and found the Polaroids, 74 photographs, organized in a stack. He called out to his partner. Both officers placed Dahmer under arrest. Dahmer, by the accounts of both officers and of Edwards, did not resist. He said with a quietness that multiple people present described as more disturbing than any outburst would have been, that he wished he were dead. The search of apartment 213 took investigators the better part of 2 full days. It required a systematic, methodical documentation process. Photographs taken at measured intervals, chain of custody established for each item before it was moved. The medical examiner's office called in to assist with the identification and handling of human remains. The 57-gallon barrel, the freezer, the skulls in the closet, the Polaroids cross-referenced against the physical evidence, a human heart in the refrigerator, wrapped in a plastic bag. Investigators who worked that scene gave interviews in subsequent years in which they described not just the content of what they found, but the sustained, cumulative psychological weight of working through it hour by hour in a small enclosed space. Several of them sought professional counseling in the months that followed. Several others described difficulty sleeping for years afterward. The medical examiner's office worked through the summer of 1991 to identify the remains recovered from the apartment. DNA analysis, dental records, and the Polaroid photographs, cross-referenced against missing persons reports filed across Milwaukee and neighboring counties, allowed investigators to build a detailed picture of who had died in that apartment and approximately when. The identification process was painstaking in the technical sense and agonizing in the human one. Many of the victims' families had filed missing persons reports months or years earlier and had been told, in some cases explicitly, that their loved ones had probably moved on voluntarily or were living elsewhere and had chosen not to maintain contact. The relief of finally knowing, of having an answer after years of suspended uncertainty, was inseparable from the nature of the answer itself. Dahmer was charged with 15 counts of first-degree intentional homicide in Wisconsin. The state of Ohio subsequently charged him with the 1978 murder of Steven Hicks, bringing the confirmed total to 16 victims. Further investigation added a 17th. He waived his right to a jury trial on the question of guilt. He admitted to all 17 killings without contest. In January 1992, a jury was convened in Milwaukee County Circuit Court solely to determine the question of legal sanity at the time of the offenses. His defense team, led by attorney Gerald Boyle, argued that no person operating within the boundaries of rational thought could have engaged in the behaviors documented in Apartment 213, that the very nature of what Dahmer had done was evidence of a profound and disqualifying mental illness. The prosecution, led by District Attorney E. Michael McCann, argued the opposite, that the planning, the methodical concealment, the sustained operational management of evidence over 13 years, the ability to hold a job and maintain a social surface and manage interactions with police and probation officers, all of it demonstrated deliberate, rational agency. The jury deliberated for approximately 5 hours before returning a verdict of sane on all counts. On February 15, 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in Wisconsin, totaling 957 years in prison with no possibility of parole. He was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, a medium-security facility about 90 miles north of Milwaukee. He initially requested protective custody, and the prison administration complied, keeping him separated from the general population in a single occupancy cell. Over the following 2 years, he requested gradual integration into the regular prison routine, work assignments, shared meal times, limited contact with other inmates. He converted to Christianity during his incarceration, was baptized in May 1994 in a whirlpool in the prison's therapy unit, and gave a series of interviews, including a lengthy conversation with Stone Phillips for NBC's Dateline, broadcast in November 1994, in which he spoke about his crimes with a flat, analytical quality that prosecutors and forensic psychologists found entirely consistent with his courtroom testimony. He said he believed he had been controlled by a force outside himself. He said he was glad he had been caught. Whether what he expressed in those interviews constituted genuine remorse or a performance calibrated for a specific audience is a question that his victims' families answered differently, and that answer belongs to them. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to a work detail with 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson, a convicted murderer serving time for the killing of his wife, and Christopher Scarver, a 25-year-old man convicted of a 1992 murder at a Wisconsin job training center with a documented history of severe mental illness, including delusions of a messianic nature. The 3 men were escorted to the gymnasium of the Columbia Correctional Institution and left unsupervised for approximately 20 minutes, while the corrections officer assigned to monitor them stepped away. Scarver used a metal bar taken from a piece of weight room equipment to beat Dahmer about the head. Anderson was also beaten. Dahmer was transported by ambulance to Divine Savior Hospital in Portage, where he was pronounced dead at approximately 9:11 a.m. He was 34 years old. Anderson died approximately an hour later. Scarver, in interviews given years afterward, stated that he had confronted Dahmer about the nature of his crimes, that Dahmer had responded without what Scarver considered adequate remorse, and that he had acted on a conviction that the prison system had failed to deliver justice. Prison administrators faced significant criticism for the supervision failures that allowed the attack to occur. The city of Milwaukee demolished the Oxford Apartments building at 924 North 25th Street in November 1992, less than a year after Dahmer's conviction. The building's owners, who had struggled to find tenants willing to live there in the aftermath of the case, sold the property to the city, which contracted for its demolition. The 3-story brick building came down in a single day. Residents who had lived there had already scattered to other addresses across the city. The lot sat empty for years. A rectangle of urban grass and broken concrete in a neighborhood that continued to carry the weight of what had happened there, not just in the apartment, but in the institutional failures that had allowed it to continue for so long. The community most directly affected by those failures was predominantly Black and Latino. The criticism directed at the Milwaukee Police Department in the years following Dahmer's arrest centered with particular force on this fact, that most of Dahmer's victims were Black or Latino men, that many of the missing persons reports filed by their families had received minimal investigative attention, and that the officers who returned Conorak's Sentasamphone to apartment 213 had dismissed the concerns of 2 Black women who were telling them something was wrong. The question of whether those reports would have been pursued more aggressively, whether those women would have been listened to more carefully, whether the pattern of disappearances would have been identified sooner if the victims had come from a different demographic. That question was asked publicly and repeatedly by community members, civil rights organizations, and journalists in the years that followed. It was asked in city council hearings. It was asked in the civil litigation proceedings. It has never received a satisfying institutional answer, because satisfying institutional answers to questions of systemic bias are rare in any era and in any city. The families of Dahmer's 17 victims pursued civil litigation against the city of Milwaukee for the failures of its police department. Several settlements were reached, the largest of which went to the families of victims who died after the May 1991 Sentasamphone incident, the clearest and most documented instance of a preventable failure. The legal process gave some families a formal acknowledgement that the system had failed their loved ones. It did not give them what they had actually lost. Lionel Dahmer, Jeffrey's father, published a memoir in 1994 titled A Father's Story, in which he examined his own role in what his son became, the things he had noticed and not acted on, the behaviors he had rationalized, the warnings he had not known how to interpret. He described finding animal remains on the property in Bath Township and accepting Jeffrey's explanations. He described the drinking, the withdrawal, the years of surface stability that he had chosen to read as recovery. It is a document of a specific and painful kind of grief, the grief of a parent who loved a child and could not reconcile that love with what the child did, and who had to live with the question of what he might have done differently. The 17 victims, Stephen Hicks, Stephen Toomey, James Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Ricky Beeks, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Strotter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Konarak Synthesomphone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft ranged in age from 14 to 33 years old. 12 of them were black. 2 were Asian American. 2 were white. 1 was Hispanic. Most of them were gay or bisexual, or were targeted in spaces associated with Milwaukee's gay community. Their names appear in court documents, in the testimony their families gave at the 1992 sentencing hearing, in the memorial services held in Milwaukee in the months after Dahmer's arrest, and in the ongoing work of the families and advocates who have spent decades insisting that these men be remembered as people and not as props in a story about someone else. They are the fixed point of this entire account, not the man who killed them, not the institutional failures that allowed it to happen, but 17 people who had lives and families and futures before they encountered Jeffrey Dahmer. Tracy Edwards, the man whose escape ended it, had his own complicated years after July 1991. He gave interviews. He struggled. In 2011, he was charged in connection with an incident in which a man was pushed off a bridge in Milwaukee, a charge that was eventually resolved without a conviction on the most serious count. His life after that night on North 25th Street was not clean or straightforward. Survival, it turned out, did not come with a simple aftermath. The Polaroid photographs that Officer Mueller found in the dresser drawer, all 74 of them, were entered into evidence during the trial proceedings and subsequently sealed by court order. They have never been publicly released. The court's reasoning was explicit. The images constituted an ongoing violation of the victim's dignity, and the families of those victims had expressed uniformly and without ambiguity that they did not want the photographs made public. That order has held for more than 30 years. In the decades since Dahmer's arrest, the case has generated an enormous volume of media, books, academic studies, documentary films, podcast series, and in 2022, a 10-episode Netflix dramatization produced by Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan that renewed widespread public attention to the case and simultaneously renewed, with considerable force, the criticism from victims' families who felt they had not been consulted during production, and that the series had, in some instances, re-traumatized them by recreating the worst moments of their lives for mass entertainment. Errol Lindsay's sister, Rita Esbel, gave an impact statement at Dahmer's 1992 sentencing that became, in the months following the Netflix release, widely circulated. A video of it spread across social media platforms, watched millions of times. She had to be physically restrained in the courtroom during that statement. She has spoken publicly and directly about what it means to watch her worst moment replicated and consumed as content, stripped of its context and its cost. Her words on that subject are worth sitting with, not as a verdict on any particular production or format, but as a reminder of what sits underneath every true crime story told in every medium. There are people for whom this is not a story at all. It is the remainder of their lives. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer does not offer the satisfaction of a mystery solved or a system that ultimately worked as designed. He was caught because one person got out, not because a pattern was recognized and investigated, not because a probation officer noticed something in apartment 213, not because a neighbor's complaint was taken seriously, not because two officers ran a name through a database on a warm night in May 1991, because Tracy Edwards, after 4 hours in that apartment, punched a man in the face and ran for a door. That is what 17 murders across 13 years ultimately came down to. One person who got out. One door that opened. The lot where the Oxford Apartments once stood has been described variously over the years. A community garden in some accounts, a vacant parcel in others, depending on the year and the source. The neighborhood around it has changed and continued to change. The Milwaukee Police Department underwent reviews, audits, and stated reforms in the years following the case. Whether those reforms addressed the specific failures that the Dahmer case exposed, the dismissal of missing persons reports from Black and Latino families, the deference shown to a white man over the objections of two Black women, the routine acceptance of explanations that should have prompted deeper questions, is a matter that Milwaukee residents and community organizations have continued to debate and contest for decades. The institutional record on that question is incomplete and contested. It probably always will be. What the Dahmer case left behind, beyond the grief, beyond the legal proceedings, beyond the decades of media, was a set of questions about institutional failure that criminologists, law enforcement trainers, and civil rights advocates have returned to repeatedly. How does a person kill 17 times across 13 years and remain invisible to the systems designed to detect exactly that pattern? The answer, when you trace it carefully through the documented record, is not that the systems were entirely blind. It is that the systems looked and then looked away. A 1982 citation, a 1986 arrest, a 1988 conviction for the assault of a child, a probation officer making regular visits to an apartment where 11 people would die, officers who returned a bleeding, disoriented 14-year-old boy to the man who had drilled a hole in his skull. Each of those moments was a door. Each door was opened and then closed again. If this case has stayed with you, the way these cases tend to stay, turning over long after the screen goes dark, there is another investigation on this channel that took nearly as long to unravel, and whose resolution was just as contingent on a single moment no one saw coming. It is waiting for you next.